Welcome to the Decentered podcast. I'm Sean Tilley. Joining me today is Damon Outlaw and Shawn Grigson, the creator of Oliphant. Thank you for joining us, Shawn. Oliphant is obviously a very interesting project and has been instrumental in developing Blocklists across the Fediverse. It is often looked at as a standard for trust and safety in terms of implementing blocks for community safety against some of the worst actors in the Fediverse. Thank you for joining me, Shawn.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much for making some time to join us on the show. We obviously are big fans of your work and benefit from your work, so thank you for coming on.
So, Shawn, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background. You had mentioned in the past that you were part of the 2022 Twitter Elon migration, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about your experience on Fedi.
Sure. I think I came along with the bandwagon, so to speak, right? Like at least one of them, that first rush of people leaving. And I guess my experience was that I think what a lot of people have is like it's like a more rough and tumble kind of landscape, right? Like not everything's been figured out. The tools aren't as polished. I think in some ways, I think a lot of what turns people off is one of the things that excites me the most. The DIY feel of it, I think, actually is something I really enjoy. Now, I know that probably appeals more to techies than it does to other people, but I think, like I've made this point before, but when you don't have an onboarding team, you don't have a marketing team, you don't have money changing hands trying to encourage people to come. It's a very different feel, right? Like it feels more like you're welcome to come here, but at the same time, no one necessarily put out like a red carpet for you. You kind of had to find your way here. And that might change with threads or something, I guess, at some point. But
Yeah, I mean, there is kind of a cultural shift happening, and thank you for bringing up threads. I think the Fediverse is a little bit weird in that for the first maybe 10, 15 years of its life, it was like kind of like a Linux user group in the sense like you had to basically know very obscure ways of doing things just to get online, just to get working, just to like join the community. And it was often very niche focused, and it was often kind of rigid in how things worked. I think nowadays, like, it's much more diverse. There's like a whole ecosystem. There's like, I don't know, something like 89 different platforms in varying different states of development.
Yeah.
And I think with threads, like, we might very well soon see like 100 million users coming into the fold that, suddenly the network, it goes from 4 million to 104 million. I think the whole like shape of things, the whole way things work is probably going to change, especially when all you have to do is sign up with threads if that's the way you want to go. Like, there's going to be a lot of non-technical users that aren't going to care about those initial aspects, so it's going to be a different experience.
That's true. I mean, I'm actually one of the servers that is not federating with threads at this point or in a foreseeable point in the future, but that's partly because I'm not entirely sure we're ready for that shift.
No, I don't think we are either, but I think it's going to happen regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there has been like some pushback on that, either on sort of an ideological level. Like FediPack, I think, is a pretty good example of people saying like, no, there's so many things we don't like about Meta, we're not going to connect with them.
Yeah.
But I think also some people are just like taking a wait and see approach.
Yeah.
I think like some people do want to have that ability to connect to their friends and families on other networks. Like I've never had much success myself in getting people to switch over to the Fediverse from my personal AFK group of friends, so to speak, because, that's not really of interest to them. It's been work to get them on there. So it's kind of interesting to see like those two perspectives, which are sometimes at odds with each other.
Yeah. I mean, it is. One thing I like to point out to people, I think, is that like our minds have been somewhat broken in terms of thinking about social media by other social media. But like someone pointed this out once, and it kind of, the simplicity of it kind of stunned me. But it's like this idea of like, why don't you just have multiple accounts? Like, why not have an account over on the server that widely federates with threads, and then why don't you have a different account over here that doesn't? And if you find that your server admin is a jerk or makes decisions you don't agree with or whatever, there's a whole migration process there by which you can basically get out from under that. And these, like, I think there's room for both of these perspectives. Basically, is what I'm like saying. There is like a conspiracy angle of this, which is basically that there are people that are also defederating from anyone that won't defederate from threads. But that's like, I don't even know how you keep track of that. Like that would be a full time, yeah, that'd be a full time job, and just cutting people on it. Like just no one's doing that. Like you'd be better off with a allow-less federation at that point. Like that's basically more what you would need if you wanted to avoid that sort of second tier thing. And I think most people are just talking about, no, like it's about federating with threads. I will say this. I got the most growth on my server when I basically signed the Fedi pack and said I wasn't going to federate with threads. Like no one else was interested in joining my server until I said that, which was really interesting. And I'm not saying that it was literally just because I publicly was saying, you know, and I don't know. I think some of the arguments against it are misrepresented, but really what it comes down to is just we're unpaid mods, and anything that is too much trouble to moderate, you know, like if you could just shut the server off in some ways, that saves you a ton of time, right? So that's why people go, your server admin doesn't get it, so therefore we're blocking your whole server. Like I understand the frustration there, but I also understand the sort of utility of like, yeah, but they're a pain in the butt and I don't want to deal with them, you know, like on the other side. And 400 million users or whatever it might be, you know, playing whack-a-mole potentially.
Yeah. So we led into the Fedi pack, and you actually answered one of the questions that I had. Well, partially because I wanted to know your thoughts on the Fedi pack, and if you can kind of expound upon that.
Yeah.
Offer some clarification, at least from your perspective, for those that maybe are very vaguely familiar with it, or because there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation, and so it would be excellent to have someone such as yourself to provide what your perspective and your view of what the Fedi Pact is. And then the second part is you had mentioned that you don't think that we are ready to allow like Meta to come into the Fedi, and I would love for you to expound upon that afterwards as well.
Sure. I mean, this is very much like centered on my opinion, of course, and obviously when I say some of this, well, let me just start with answering your first question about like what is Fedi Pact to me. And I was, I guess, admittedly, I'll say this now, I was a little alarmed at some of what like the meta around Fedi Pact, like after I signed it. Like in my opinion, really it was very simple. It was like, are you going to federate with threads, yes or no? And I was like, nope, I'm not gonna. I have no interest. I don't have, my thinking was I've spent so much time, like, I'll give you an example. Let's say like the admin of Detroit Riot City forms their own new server called whatever, right? We hear about that. Sometimes we just preemptively go, you know what? There's nothing good coming out of that server. I'm just going to, before we even have relationships, I'm just going to preemptively say no. And maybe for some reason someone else takes over the server later, maybe something changes, or maybe it's like, oh, that was silly, there's nothing wrong with that server, and then we let them in later. So that was kind of the position I was taking with threads, was like, we have no reason to assume they're going to be a good neighbor. They're probably just going to, be loud and very much like, well, we're the biggest now, so this is the way that it is, and this is how we moderate, and this is how you should moderate, and like whatever. Applying its volume. But I just felt like, for me, it was like that kind of social media is everywhere. And like, there's not a lot of social media like this. And so I was kind of trying to, in a way, sort of preserve some of that and say, no, like, I mean, just like any other server with bad moderation, which Meta undoubtedly has, despite the fact they have paid mods, they just have a lot of bad content out there. Like Libs of TikTok. TikTok is not welcome on any Fedi platform from which I federate with, right? And that's sort of just how things are. But Threads isn't like that. And so, all kinds of that stuff will be basically bleeding over into the Fedi. And there's a lot of people who just don't even want any part of that. The what is considered acceptable discourse there, they don't want that sort of bleeding over here. So, but my thinking was like, if I wanted to federate with Threads or something, I would create a Mastodon social account, and like follow someone from there if I wanted to, like, not that I'm going to, I'm just saying like I could, and anyone on my server that didn't like it could also do the same thing. So I wasn't trying to put a whole lot of intention behind it other than just saying, hey, if you want to I thought it was, here's a list of servers that will not be federating with Meta, so I know I can join them, or I can know I should leave them because I don't agree with that stance. Like it's a way of, I just thought a simple way of informing like users, do I want to join one of these servers or do I want to leave one? As a result of the Threads policy, right? Or do I particularly care? But it's really more of a way of showing, I think, just saying like, no, we're not going to federate. And but I heard that there's other stuff that comes from that. There's like people were saying that, like I think I said before, that there's knock-on effect where if you're not on the list, then we're not going to federate with you or something, which I've not really heard anybody realistically ever saying that. I've heard of people afraid that's going to happen, and there may be one server admin somewhere who's doing it. I don't know, but largely, this is also what I say about blocklist recommendations. A few people will agree, a few people will take a lesser recommendation, and then most people will just ignore it. And that's pretty much what always happens. You get some people agreeing, some people taking a lesser recommendation, and then a larger number just ignoring is usually what I find. So the last part about we're not ready for Meta, I'm thinking, I've had people explain why I think that we're okay. I'm just thinking of the volume of messages and data and that stuff. That's what I'm thinking.
That's been my concern too, is just that like a lot of people will talk about the size and the connectivity and just like a change of the network's characteristics, but I think like dealing with millions and millions of new people and connections and messages passing is going to probably be quite stressful on server admins from both a technical and social standpoint. And that's going to be a whole like can of worms in terms of how do we figure out how to make this less crazy for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I think like Mastodon is also a very thirsty beast in terms of server resources and things like that. If you run a Mastodon server, and like I could not run Oliphant Social without a CDN for all of the images. And I was just checking the other day, I have 890 gigabytes, I think, of cached data, like media. Again, this is on the CDN, but this is for a server where, okay, I follow like 900 people, but, and I know this surprised Damon, so I'll say it out loud for you too, but like, I mean, my server has like 6 people on it, like active people. It's not a server of 100 or 300. And I know that some people feel like it's a big giant server with lots of people on it, but that's just because I'm a loudmouth and I punch above my weight. But otherwise, like it's a small server, but my little tiny ass server, I have to pay for essentially storing, like ridiculous amounts of data every month.
Storage is cheap, but at the same time, in spite of the cost, like you're always going to be like accruing more and more of it. Like, yeah, I can use object storage or a CDN to catch like a terabyte of stuff,
Yeah.
but then I have a terabyte of stuff I have to worry about.
And I have stuff if you're connecting to a bunch more people. I mean, I know that what they say is it's all about follows. So like if you don't follow anybody, you're not going to get their content. I get that,
Yeah.
but if there's like millions more people to follow, then there's still lots more data flowing through the network. So I don't know. I thought too, like you said, that wait and see is a smart approach too. Like whether like I would advocate that it's good to just start out defederated just to see how other servers that are so gung-ho about this are doing first. Like just kind of get a glimpse and see, how's their data usage going? How's their how's the moderation going, right? Before you decide if you want to jump in. Because once you jump in and there's connections, you have to go through the dreaded problem of, I'm severing follow relationships and with the suspension. Starting out with one, not so much a disruption.
I think it's also interesting too that Meta it's still kind of unknown like how they're going to be a participant like in sort of the trust and safety aspect. Um, I know that like IFTAS is kind of trying to do a lot of like high level like moderator support kinds of things, and there's a number of other projects in the Fediverse.
Yes, I'm working with them actually.
Awesome. Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, was just like how do these different projects collaborate?
Yeah,
But like, I think like it's an interesting question as to, does a massive corporate entity even have to opt into working with them, or will they? Like,
yeah,
I would love to see a reality where Meta's just like, oh yeah, we've got people and we're gonna, sit down and talk and we're gonna work together and kumbaya. But like at the same time, might not happen. There's no reason for them to do anything. They're a giant corporation.
yeah,
Yeah, but I think what we should also consider, just in the interest of fairness, and you and I have these discussions personally, Sean, but uh, in terms of Meta, and I'm not obviously excusing their track record, but in terms of their moderation tactics, right? Like they spend about
mm.
$1 billion per year on moderation, right? So this is not a company that's not doing anything.
No, that's true.
I've always said the biggest problem with uh, Meta and big social in general is the fact that they're so large, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like these are global platforms, and there's different cultures, different languages, different governments, and you're trying to uh, moderate that and
Yeah,
curate that with a very broad brush, right? And so that's where I believe it comes across as negligence, because
mm.
you're taking the approach of, maybe it's because it's the U.S. Based country, right? Company, and
Mm.
so you're having a U.S. centric kind of mind when you're dealing with somewhere in the Middle East, or just or some really obscure island or something. And so I think that's a big part of the failures, and why I believe it's appealing to come into the Fediverse, right? Because a
Yeah,
very small sample size of that is look at subreddits, right, and Reddit, and just kind of having this communal governance, right, and having people like be set with the expectations right at the gate, know what to expect in terms of the atmosphere and how it's going to be officiated and moderated, and that's there's a lot of appeal to that, right? You don't have to take this global centric approach that is you're trying to combine all these different cultures that have different views on things, and
mm.
your failure rate is going to be significantly less, right? And so I
Yeah,
think that is a big appeal to why they want to come here. And let's also be honest and realistic. There's aspects and instances within the Fediverse that Meta thinks is atrocious. Like
mm.
they would be like, hey, the way that they conduct themselves, like we wouldn't federate with them, right? And already, as we've seen, Sean, we wrote a report
Yeah,
about authorized fetch. There's already instances that Meta is blocking, right? So
yeah.
so they're very aware of what's going
Yeah,
on.
Gleasonator's all pissed. Alex Gleason's all pissed about it, I think, right?
Yeah.
He wrote a authorized fetch workaround because of that.
And that is kind of like, I think, is the silver lining here, is that the Mastodon in particular has operated on certain assumptions that the protections they offer is enough.
Yeah,
And I think like we really need to stress test the heck out of that, especially with Meta coming in, if we hope to grow and keep our users safe beyond just playing whack-a-mole blocking.
yeah,
Um, it's just, I think there are better privacy protections, better user consent models, better permissions that we could give for who can do what with what. And I think we're going to see that, but I think the only way to get there is to accidentally realize that the last 15 years we haven't thought about it, and oops, now it's a problem, which is the way Fediverse development tends to play out sometimes.
I agree.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your experience with Oliphant, and just I know that you kind of become central to a lot of trust and safety work. Like, how did that start out, and what are you doing today?
Sure. I'll give the abbreviated version of how I started out, but um, basically, I started out as a new admin. Oliphant.social was basically a quick, simple play on Mastodon social, right? It's except with a token-esque. That's where at least I thought, elephant came from. It's also the Dutch word for
Hmm.
elephant. Anyway, yeah, like they use it
Oh,
today. It's not even an old word. But
hmm.
anyway, I set that up, and I immediately encountered a barrage of hate speech and slurs and things like that. that I recognize for any new user would be appalling, right? Because the unfiltered internet is a sewer. Like, I mean, anyone anywhere can say anything, and we forget that because, like you said, you've got these big moderation groups that are taking care of the worst of it, like the stuff that you would never see, right? Is already sort of
Yeah.
preemptively scrubbed, and what you're left with is sort of like people playing within the lines, which still might not be acceptable, but they're not doing the worst stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas the worst stuff is all available on the Fediverse unless you put up some filters. And because it's decentralized, no one really wanted to be like, well, my list is the best, because now you're this centralized source saying, use my list, right? And that's everyone's like, well, who are you? And that's where I got this whole idea of trusted counsel and like trust being central to the whole thing, because ultimately it's like, don't trust me and my blog. Like, if you don't trust me, you definitely shouldn't use the Blocklist. Like I've said that many times. If you don't trust, like, I'm trying to be transparent with everything that I do, because and even like, here's how you can run it yourself and like get the same thing. If you don't trust my process, use your own process. Like, but here's how I built it. But it's just because, and that was me giving it away because I started being bothered by this sort of centralized nature of it, of like, I'm an authority. Well, it's on Oliphant's block list, and it's like, I understand that, but it's a short trip from that to like, we all sort of want someone to give us the answer, right? And that's kind of, there's one really frustrating aspect, I think, for people who come from traditional social media, is they're like, well, how do I get the answer? Who's the person in charge? I want to speak to the manager of the Fediverse. Like, and like, there is no one. Like, we can't get rid of that guy you hate. Like, he will be there forever on another server, talking whatever stuff that he wants, but we can't kick him off. Like, he's just there, and that's.
I'm sorry, but you are the manager.
Exactly.
You, the user.
So, you mentioned something about size too, and I think size plays a role. Like, there's even a grousing towards like Mastodon Social and this and that. Like, well, we're doing their moderation for them. I've heard that from other admins before, and but it's the same thing. Like, even they are a little bigger, and so they can't catch everything as much as maybe a smaller server can. And they're open registration, and so the open registration adds some difficulties too, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that's a fully figured out thing. I'm always concerned when I see an instance that has like a couple 100,000 people, and then they have like a moderation team of like 3.
Yeah, the mod ratio. Yeah,
I want to believe that there is like a pretty healthy ratio that you can have, where for every 1,000 people, maybe you have like a dozen or so. Even that kind of seems like a stretch. I don't know what the number is specifically. But I feel like with the current landscape today, we're putting a lot of pressure on very small teams of people to do the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And I think like that's probably detrimental to their mental health as well as just their well-being in general. That is a full-time job, and a lot of them don't even get paid.
I mean, this is why to continue answering your question too, like, this is why I sort of tried to give away some of the block listing stuff, right? Like and I've said that even that process is like, it's an interim step on the road to something better. Like, that's not here yet, and because you're talking about like, how is this, like, how is it evolving, right? Like, IFTAS and like other things, are now involved. What shocks me to the core still to this day, you got Amelia, I'll call her out. This is Miss M, if you're familiar. Amelia Smith does a lot of moderation tooling work in Mastodon, does a lot of, but not a single thing that she has done has been paid for at all. Like, it's literally free open source work that has been donated to Mastodon. And that's the reason I sort of posted a block list. It's the reason, whatever, you look around, you're like, oh, who's doing this thing? Surely someone is. And then I said, like, in any anarchic kind of space, whenever you ask the question, who's doing this, the question is usually, I am, because no one else, like, I have to step forward and do this, because if I want this, I'm going to have to make it,
do the hard stuff. Yeah,
exactly. And but the foundations and the money, like Nivenly, and like there's different groups that are involved in trying to donate, but they aren't dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about, maybe a million's involved somewhere here, but like, but nothing like massive, massive, massive amounts of money. The thing that still blows my mind, and I know this is a European thing, they have health insurance there, so like they don't have to get paid as much, but like Eugen makes now my starting salary from 1998 when I started programming. He makes like 35,000 a year, and
It hurts.
I know.
Yeah.
And I heard that this is one of the reasons that the whole thing actually kind of excites me, though. I mean, people give him a lot of shit, but shortly after the Elon debacle, apparently a big venture capital firm came along and was like, "Here's millions and millions of dollars to build whatever," and he was like, "Take that money and stick it up your ass." And that was that was like, you know, fair play to you. But I don't know who ever says no to that much money. I mean, in capitalism, that's just unheard of. That someone does that. That said, because he said no to that massive, massive, massive amount of money, or at least massive in terms of Fediverse terms, we're moving along at the pace that we're moving. But IFTAS, for example, has a lot of funding now, and it's focused primarily on building. I can tell you one thing that I've built, because it's going to be going live soonish. We're just going through another round of changes on it, but FediCheck, or Cariad as it's also known, is what we're building. And I guess the simplest way I could describe it is it's like an online subscribable Fedi block hole, right? Like you go in, the IFTAS gets to kind of say, here's the sources we're pulling from, and they're all big sources like Mastodon Social and Mastodon App and Hackaderm, and I mean anyone that you can think of with, you know, a significant number of users is basically a source on that. And then they have their own list. And just like the Oliphant block lists, right? We have like basically a high, medium, low. They're called different things, but basically higher, you know, like 100% consensus, 80, 50. And that's configurable, right? But whatever IFTAS decides they want to do with it, they can change the configuration on that and change the sources. But basically everything's weighted the same. So like if 5 sources agree, you know, then we put them on the list. We take the least severe recommendation and we push blocks to your server. And if you're familiar with like Elk or something where you go through the OAuth flow where it requests permissions and stuff like that.
Got it. Yeah.
The idea is a server admin comes in, boom, it comes in, it reads all your blocks, compares them, and you get to opt in and say, manage these blocks if you want the server to manage them, or otherwise it will ignore them. But it's a way of keeping blocks in sync and push to your server in a like in a minute. You know, just say you set up your brand new Mastodon server, and this is the focus is on new admins. You go to the site, you go in, you know, give a quick pass through and say enable, you know, hit the enable button, and then within like a couple minutes, you get the blocks pushed to your server, and you know you're set.
Wow!
And that was after getting laid off at the beginning of September. IFTAS came to me with that project, and I knocked it out in about 3 weeks.
Wow!
And there's another round of stuff we're doing now. Like we're adding, I think Hrefna mentioned like that human review is like a key cornerstone piece of any blocklist service. There needs to be a manual human person, which is not in mine. Mine is literally math. Like it's like these people say, well, there is human review, but the human review happens at the source level, right? That they put them on their list. I'm not reviewing. But IFTAS had me add that essentially. So like when a new domain shows up, it doesn't appear on a block list until an actual human at IFTAS goes in and says, yes, add this one to the list. Like it, you know, it's so that we had that added layer of safety and basically added super admin access, which didn't exist before.
How does a piece of infrastructure like that protect against bad actors that maybe they hook up to that and they're uploading like sort of like a corrupted block list or a block list with inverse recommendations? Like, how do you deal with conflicts like that?
So in this case, and this is different from some other blocklist or software proposals like this, but basically it doesn't really matter because the server admins are saying these are the trusted sources. So even if it reads in their block list, they don't get to become a trusted source unless, you know, the server admins of IFTAS decide they are.
So you have to be vetted. No, that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'd like to do eventually is, you know, if you have 100 subscribers to your service, you could check all their blocks, and instead of you could have a communal block list rather than a trusted source block list, right? But that's not what we're doing currently yet.
Yeah.
It's just more like the problem with like Fedi block hole is you have to have a certain amount of technical aptitude to set it up. It's kind of fiddly. This is just supposed to be kind of like that, but like, don't even think about it anymore.
Yeah.
Just go in, and not that it manages all your blocks, but like this will take care of like, a reasonable subset of them. And the other thing that's being discussed now, and I don't know how much of this I can discuss because there is some NDA components to this, but basically something to address CSAM
Yeah.
is the other thing that they're working on right now. And I know that's a big concern. Kind of different targets if you think about it. Like
Yes.
the push blocks to your server, Mastodon Social will never use that in a million years, but like a lot of other smaller servers would, and
Yeah.
that's kind of the whole point. But scanning of uploaded images.
I think everyone across the board would probably say like, "Oh, a CSAM detector? Yeah, hell yeah, I'm going to turn that on." Cuz nobody at the end of the day wants to deal with that.
Exactly. And it's technically a big vulnerability, right? I mean, um, especially on an open registration server where you can't necessarily control who's going to come in, burn their bridge, and then get kicked off, but not before they've done who knows what kind of damage. So um, that's something that is definitely being looked at right now. And there's funding and a team. And unfortunately, I was going to work on that team, but I actually can't because I'm too busy with other contracts at the moment. But Amelia's heading that up, and um, I would like to. I would have to work like 60-hour weeks to do all the stuff that I'm queued up for.
Totally get it. So
But
like, these are really interesting projects, especially when it's like communally sourced, vetted sources, pulling in block lists.
yeah,
But sometimes I think servers are a little less black and white in terms of like, you know, are they good guys? Are they bad guys? Like I think there's a couple of debacles that have happened recently where it's been a sort
yep,
of he said, she said kind of thing, and people have taken sides. Like if you're an admin caught in the
yeah.
crossfire, maybe some bad stuff has happened, and you're actually willing to make amends. Is there a way? Do you have recourse to make things better going forward, or are you caught in that defederation black hole?
Uh, that's a great that's a great point. I mean, I used to say this to people too. I mean, and even I've um, had issues where I've upset some people and have hurt people. Um, and some of them probably will never want to speak to me again. But I feel like that's the messy part of making amends. Like, this is what I used to say is like, it's like, well, how do I get off the block list? And I'd say, well, you're blocked currently by mastodon.art and by this and by that and whatever. Like, you need to talk to at least one of them, and that's going to change the threshold to drop you off the server. And that's how you can make amends and get off the list. However, I realize that for many people, that's a bullshit answer. I've heard that from people many times. They've told me that, especially from servers that end up on the list. They're like, well, you're telling me I have to go through like 8 different people, or I have to talk to 4 or 5 different people. But like, they're not collectively getting together and saying, put this on the list, yes, no, which is what I think a lot of people assume in their heads. Like, they're not voting. You're getting voted on because you appeared on their block list. There was a human review element there.
Again, this is like the can I speak to the manager kind of thing.
Yeah. But I think one thing, and I want to address, I think Damon's mentioned this before too, and there is a lot of concern about the sort of dogmatic, all or nothing kind of, approach, especially when you do like server level blocks, and wishing we just basically had more nuance in that process. And this is where I will talk about the fires proposal that Amelia is also, I mean, the proposal already exists actually, trying to get funding through NLNet for it.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of it is that it's a recommendation and labeling server. And so the idea is that it doesn't block anything. It doesn't, and you can configure the server, and there can be multiple councils that run their own fire server, but it's your recommendation server that you're in with some other group of people. And you can essentially apply labels to things like this is hate speech, this is whatever. And so something that then consumes that fire's data source. So fires might read from, just to give a concrete example, it might read from the dad space. It might read from, um, you know, actual server block lists, whatever. But it also could just be like people logging in, like using the interface to say, this domain has this issue. And then you have another server that will consume and pull in recommendations and labeling and things like that. And so this is one of my proposals on the horizon, is something called block sync, which is like an evolution of FediCheck. But the idea is that you're applying recommendations, you're not applying blocks. Like as a server admin, you might say, okay, Detroit Riot City is blocked, sure, across the whole server. But other times you might say, I'm blocking this one as a recommendation. And then users could then see, oh, they're like, this server was just recommended by your admin as a block. And then they could apply it at a server level. They could choose to ignore it,
Right.
Whatever, but you're not. That's one aspect that I want to do or want to give people, is I want to address that crowd of people too, because there is, the people who's like, sorry, these are the tools we have. We're going to shut you off. There's that side, right? And then there's the other side, which is like, yeah, but what about people caught in the middle? What about if the server admin doesn't really want to block them, but they feel like they have to for certain users and like, what about that middle ground? What do we do then?
Yeah.
And that's what we're really missing today. And that's kind of, I think, what will be built. But and to be fair, I don't actually know what the Bad Space is doing at the moment. I know they're doing some stuff too.
Yeah. It sounds like we would really benefit too from just surfacing context. I've always wondered what a Fediverse version of community notes from Twitter would look like, because being able to label things like the way you described with fires sounds like a really good application of that kind of concept.
Yeah, and I know that Amelia wants to build in more labeling and actually wants to change how domains work in Mastodon itself, so that you have domain filters rather than domain blocks and domain allows.
Yep.
So everything kind of moves into a more filtering model, and then you'd have labels and things like that too. And that could consume, your Mastodon instance could potentially consume data from a Fire server as well.
Yep.
But that's all stuff that I think needs to be built. We are actually, we collectively, are trying to improve the current model and address some of the, I hate to even use this phrase, but the HOA concerns and stuff like that, by building better tools.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, we're also, in some of the same chats, right, where this conversations are happening, and Ms. M is incredible with the work that is being done. And I look forward to fires being out there. But the labeling system is huge, and it's one of the aspects that I believe Blue Sky gets done correctly, right? With their composable moderation and their content labeling, it's huge. My criticism is more so that their system currently lacks some nuance, but in terms of the labels, but it is in the right direction, right? I believe as you were saying, there's a lot of middle ground missing in terms of all of this is happening on an instance level, where my personal belief is we should be empowering users, right? I believe that it should be, once things get to such a egregious level where admins need to step in. But if we are providing these tools on a user level, on a client level, that empowers them, right, and will allow people to proactively seek out the experiences that they want to seek out, especially on those edge cases, right? Maybe there's that stuff that is not exactly against the rules, but it really teeters. And, some people are okay with that, others are not, right? And then that can put an admin in a very tough bind, because it's like, okay, well, this person that's not okay with it, that they're bringing it to the attention, but at the same time, it's not technically breaking any rules, right? And so it's like, if people had these tools to filter out these things and have these experiences and use these content labels, that kind of also alleviates the pressure that falls on the admins and moderators.
I absolutely agree. I think that so much of what we have today is the software drives, the the experience and how people moderate. And because there is no, there's such a focus on the instance level, like you're saying, um, there just aren't the tools. Like even something like the report tool in Mastodon had to be added after probably, I don't know how many, probably years of people yelling for it, to be added. But we could have such better,
Yeah.
we could have labeling tools and things like that could feed into, a system where you could say like once you have the data, you can do so much with it. Once you have labeling data, and the labeling could be not just on a server, it could be on a user, it could be on a post, but like we could have, it doesn't really matter what the labels are attached to. And I think actually Fires is written in such a way that it really doesn't matter what the entity is. You can label just about anything. But if you have that, once you have that data, you can start making decisions on it. You can say, oh, like, kind of like you said, like this falls in a gray area. This is like, nudity, right? Nudity. This has a nudity tag on it. Some people will be like, I don't mind nudity, and they
Yep.
will leave that up. And then other people can, like, you can actually give users the ability to filter based on tags, and
Yeah.
control that experience a lot more. And I do think a lot of admins, especially the more, I don't want to say litigious ones, the ones that are more inclined to block, more safety minded, I guess, are basically going from the perspective of like, you don't have the tools to not see this, like, so therefore we have to take a preemptive step to make sure you don't have to encounter it first. Like you don't have to encounter the abuse first before, that's what they're trying to do, right? And say, I'm cutting off this server because the chances of someone from my server dealing with a problem, the server is pretty good. But if you could just, have filtering applied, from a trusted source, that's the whole idea of Fires too, is that you can't manipulate the data because if you're a disreputable server, you're not able to contribute to that labeling server anyway. You would, and there might be at some point 1 to 5. I don't know how many of these servers there will be at some point. What I found when I made a block list was I thought, oh, everyone's going to make this and they'll be like the Oliphant block lists and the so-and-so block list, but that's not actually happened. And I think sometimes it's just because when a thing already exists, you don't need to make another copy of that thing. Like people, it's just utility. People only have so much time in their lives.
Right.
So if someone's already gone to the trouble of doing the block list thing, then, maybe I don't have to do that. I think that's what a lot of people would maybe say anyway. But I don't know if that answers your question. I'm rambling.
No.
But Fires,
it's a good ramble.
will solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm definitely curious about, I know I brought it up a little bit earlier, is that there's like maybe 5 or 6 different trust and safety efforts that are going on that are all kind of like different levels. IFTAS is kind of more moderation minded, or at least like giving admins the tools that they need. FSEP was like a Nivenly proposal. There's the bad space. I know of FediFence. Like, how do all these different projects collaborate together? Is there like a central meeting point, or like do people reuse resources? Like, how does that work? How do you come to an agreement on how to do stuff?
That's a really great question. I would say it is very isolated in the sense that like IFTAS does its own IFTAS things, and the bad space does its own things, and Nivenly does its own things, and those are kind of the big forces I'm aware of. I do want to give a shout out to DBO or DB0 or FediSphere. That's a pretty awesome tool as well. I like it because it's a whole other, model of trust and safety, and so it's very, very unique project. I haven't really looked at it as much as I could probably, but yeah, they're all very isolated, and they have their own funding and their own board that probably is looking for slightly different things. So like the IFTAS board, this is one frustrating thing, I guess, for me about working for IFTAS is that they don't make software. They can't make open source software. There's reasons for that have to do with 501s and stuff. So really they make apps that people use, but the code itself much as I would love to share it with you and let you run it, I can't, because technically it's, it would become very difficult for them, like in their funding. So like they're sort of limited by virtue of the type of nonprofit that they are, of what they can actually do. Whereas NLNet, which is a European based, they give out grants and stuff, like charitable grants to build stuff. And that's a completely different group. I mean, there's limitations there where you have to be an EU citizen. But their specific goal is they pay you when you produce a piece of open source software. Like you give a proposal, I want to build this piece of open source software. You deliver that at some point, post the Git repo, whatever, and then they give you, the money that the grant they promised you.
Yep.
Now, that's supposed to be 100% charitable money, but I think in the United States they don't care about that. It's just income.
Yep.
So I don't think you get to deduct anything or anything like that just because it's charitable.
Yeah, unless you set up a nonprofit and that goes to the nonprofit. But yeah, otherwise it's taxable income to an individual.
Yeah, but I can tell you that, I mentioned Amelia, for example, multiple funding sources. Has received grants, has I think even received a little bit from Nivenly, a little bit from IFTAS, all doing different things. She did get some funding a little bit for the Fires proposal, so I was able to build some of that. But obviously, that stacks going to go with what's called FediMod, which is an organization or group I'm in with her. And BlockSync will maybe be the block pushing part of that, or the sync to your server part of that. But anyway, I don't know. I might have wandered off your point. But
No. It's a broad playing field, and it sounds like, like with any situation where you have a bunch of individual people trying to build things and contribute, there's going to be points of convergence. There's going to be independent efforts. There's going to be things like Fetty's here where, a dude just looks at something, he's like, I'm going to do this other thing, and goes off the beaten path. And, everybody, I think, it's important to understand that everybody is trying to do what they think is the best thing. And I think collaboration does emerge out of that. But sometimes it's like, well, my thing is probably better than this other thing. I'm more comfortable with doing this. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah.
It's definitely
it's an army of cats.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of cat herding.
Yeah, exactly. As I mentioned too, as far as coordination, like there's Matrix chat for IFTAS and stuff like that. And there's a little bit of overlap there because there's a moderation group that meets every week, which I still have not attended actually, which you would think I would. But I think there's even a stipend for people that are part of that. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but that's just so that mods can sort of be part of the conversation, and they're so that's I'm sort of impatient. Like I think a lot of people are like, why is this taking so long? Like, why aren't we there yet? Why don't I have quote?
Because it's hard.
Yeah, exactly. And there's not the money and the time. Like I actually took basically a full-time job because I just couldn't anymore support myself purely on, Fediverse money, basically. And by the time I got a contract that probably could sustain me, like it's come too late. I actually have to turn it over to somebody else for a while, I think. But it's just, there's just like IFTAS actually probably has more money than Mastodon has, it feels like, in some ways. Like I granted, we saw their report for like the previous year. We haven't seen it for this past year, like how much money's coming in or whatever to Mastodon. But I would have thought they would have, had more money.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the lump sum seems like a lot, but then you look at the payout to the CEO and you're like, oh, that's less than like you said, a software engineer in 1998 would have made.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a lot. And I think like we had to figure out a better way to secure those kinds of funds, because right now it does sort of feel like a big circle of people panhandling from each other. And I'm not so sure how sustainable that is long term.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I don't actually know the answer to how to solve that. I do know that,
You know,
like, in some ways, like, IFTAS is solving it. Like, it's one example of that being solved, where, like, a foundation is formed towards a certain goal, and there's money raised for the purpose of doing it. But yeah, again, it goes back to, I think, what something I said before. Just it's not anti-capitalist per se. It's just that
no.
it doesn't need capitalism the way that a venture capitalist funded social media company needs capitalism. Like
Yeah.
I said before, you start in the hole, you're in debt millions of, maybe billions, but probably millions of dollars to some firm. You have to monetize immediately. That drives your entire application. So that also drives
Right.
getting people on the platform, advertising, onboarding experience, like analytics to track every single interaction and see which ones are working and which ones aren't. We don't have any of that. None of it. And so to me, like, the fact that it actually works at all is kind of
It's
amazing.
amazing.
Yeah, like the fact that more people show up every month, like, despite there not actually being more advertising, like, that just blows me away. I don't know if there's more people are showing up every month, but I have a feeling it's steadily
Oh
growing
my gosh.
slowly. It's just that should not happen. In
Yeah.
typical in a typical space, right? Like, if you were talking about any other thing in the capitalist world, like, you without advertising, you don't grow. Without monetization, like, how I remember someone saying early on, this was kind of funny. They were saying, like, I'm not sure, whatever, the Fediverse is going to last, unless they get the brands here or something. And I was like, what do we need the brands for? For money? Like, because
Yeah.
I'm
What money?
I'm pretty sure I'd keep running my server even though it costs me money, without actually
Yeah.
taking any advertising. And that's the whole other thing too. That model doesn't work. Like, an advertiser
Yeah.
would have to pay me to run ads on my server, and they'd have to do it for like 20 other people, like, or 20, 1,000 other people. Why would they? Why? Like, that just,
Yeah. The incentive doesn't make sense.
yeah.
It does remind me too of a meme that I saw some time back. It was just like some status somebody posted where, did the typical venture capitalist is like, oh well, you can't really have growth without capital. You need to have that as a driving force. And then it's thousands of nerds on the internet are all snickering as they're like creating things for free that are completely unprofitable, and
Yeah.
like suddenly like millions of people are using that in spite of the fact that's always been like a really funny reality to me is that like yeah we're probably 1% of like all users worldwide perhaps, but like maybe not even that, but like in spite of that we have found community and
Mm.
development and growth, and like we're at this really interesting point where yeah actually this could be a big part of the future of the internet.
Yeah. I mean, it's really exciting.
Yeah, that brought me to my next question. Is especially I know there's this looming massive event that's going to happen towards the end of this year, but even prior to that, right? I want to say the end of this month into next month, there's going to be 250,000 people coming in with Flipboard,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And then I want to say in the spring they'll be fully federated, every which way. Uh, and then Tumblr,
Mm.
the conversation has slightly picked up, but that's still something that can happen, and that's about like 25 million to 50
Mm.
million accounts. Um, so just with all of this attention and the lack of tooling, even though you're working on some, and Miss M is working on some, but what are your thoughts on the short term and long term future of the Fediverse?
Oh, well, I mean, short term, I think this is kind of hints back to what I said before about us not being ready, but we will get ready. We will make ourselves ready by necessity if we have to, right? But I just mean to say, like, there's going to be some scrambling, I think, because, like you said, we don't have all the tools that we need. A great example of that, just to illustrate, it would be like when Lemmy and Kevin showed up, and all of a sudden, like, oh shit, we actually have to, like, build in moderation to this thing. Um,
Yeah.
and they did in, like, record lightning speed time. And I know it's probably not even perfect, its implementation, but that's a great example of, I think, what the beginning of this will kind of look like. you'll see stuff where like, one thing I think of is like, let's say when Flipboard or someone else like begins federating, there's a whole lot of other tools that have to be built. Like if someone sends a report to your server, for example, does it respond to the report? Does it know what to do with the report being against one of your, the people commenting on your server? Does that even work? Have you even implemented that? Like they don't have to. So there could just be, your users show up and they're like, and then that creates a knock-on effect of like, oh crap, block Flipboard because they can't moderate any of their users. Like this is the kind of thing I think that might happen, at the beginning, is that kind of, thing. More long term though, I think it's Mecca who said something like that. He's betting on the Fediverse. Like I think it wins because nothing else exists like it. And that includes Blue Sky. I think Blue Sky is a currently single server invite only, ostensibly federated, but not yet, environment. So it's really untested. And also what you can't do with it that you can do with the Fediverse, just by the way they've designed it, is it's the whole notion that you can like run your own server, right? You can run your own, I think it's like Relay or whatever, but as far as the BGS is concerned, that's something you need to host at like a big data center. You can't run that yourself. Mom and pop can't have their own BGS. So like, so I think that aspect keeps the Fediverse around almost indefinitely, just because of the fact that, anyone can sort of set up their own radio station. You don't have to get permission to set up your radio station. You can just set one up and run things as you wish. And I do think, there'll be better tools. I'm excited about things like Bonfire. I have been for a while, actually, about that one, because I think I said initially, and we'll see if this prediction holds true, at least at the time, I considered it to be the next big thing, like post-Mastodon. Like, I think it'll be pretty huge because they've thought about some of the nuances, I guess, building circles and things like that, and just various other aspects. I hadn't looked at as much as I wish I had, but there's a lot of other projects out there.
We have an article actually about Bonfire coming out soon. We actually sat down and chatted with them off the podcast, just to sort of see like what they're building and their ideas. And like, it's so much more than just like having better like base functionality for like user permissions and stuff. Like they are like actually trying to provide a framework for next gen Fediverse apps. And that kind of thinking is like so much bigger than just like, we want to be bigger than Mastodon. It's, we want to empower the next, 20 million, 30 million people in the next dozens of projects that emerge in our space. Really cool stuff though.
Yeah, it does look really cool.
Well, Shawn, thank you so much for taking time with us today. Is there anything like top of mind that you'd like to share with our listeners about, what you're doing, what you're passionate about, just stuff that you'd like people to know?
I guess just that I'm probably not going anywhere in terms of contributing to the trust and safety space. I do think that there's room for lots of improvement in what I've already done, and in terms of managing Blocklists, and in terms of giving more power to users to control their experience. I've been immersed in that conversation for a while, and I guess I'm looking forward to furthering it and building more cool stuff. So I guess that's it.
No, that's terrific. You can find Shawn at Oliphant at oliphant.social. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the We Distribute's Decentered podcast. I'm Shawn Till. You can find me at Dead Superhero at Mozilla.social.
And you can find me at Damon at Mozilla.social.
You can follow We Distribute in a number of different ways. You can follow us directly via ActivityPub for our website, at news@wedistribute.org. We are also on at We Distribute at Mozilla.social. We also have relays to Twitter, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Nostr, Facebook, the whole shebang. You can find it on our website under the Follow Us link. We also have an Open Collective and a Patreon. Both of those are opencollective.com/WeDistribute and patreon.com/WeDistribute. Thank you so much for joining us. You've been the best. Bye.